The Bugatti Chiron Supersport 300 Plus stood dead in the VIP garage of the Meridian Grand Hotel, 2 hours before Alexandra Harmon was set to walk onto the biggest stage of her year. 5 technical teams from $5 billion firms had come and gone, laptops open, machines running, heads shaking. Not one of them could explain why a $3.9 million machine refused to start. Then Mason Cole walked in. He brought no laptop, no scanner, no diagnostic device. He crouched beside the car, placed one hand on the body panel, and listened. Then he stood up and said one sentence. What did he know in 5 minutes that 5 teams couldn't find in 2 hours? The answer will surprise you. Alexandra Harmon had not arrived at the Autotech Summit to blend in. She arrived at it the way she arrived at everything: calculated, precise, and impossible to ignore. At 43, she ran Titan Core Technologies, a company that had quietly become one of the most powerful forces in artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicle systems, valued at $14 billion and climbing. She wore the success of Titan Core the way some people wore expensive watches, not to check the time, but to make a point. The keynote address she was scheduled to deliver at 2 o'clock that afternoon was not simply a presentation. It was a declaration, and she intended to make it unforgettable. The plan had been Connor Walsh's idea, but Alexandra had approved it immediately. Connor, her director of operations and the man who translated her instincts into logistics, had spent 3 weeks coordinating what he privately called the arrival sequence. Titan Core had just closed a Series D funding round at $2.1 billion, and the financial world was watching. 20 journalists from the industry's most influential outlets had been positioned to photograph the moment Alexandra stepped out of her personal vehicle in front of the venue's main entrance. The car itself was the statement, a Bugatti Chiron Supersport 300 Plus in jet black, the kind of machine that made engineers stop mid-sentence. She had owned it for 14 months. It had never once failed her. Mason Cole opened the garage at 7 in the morning, the same way he opened it every morning, without ceremony, without anyone watching, and without anything to prove. Cole's auto sat on a side street 4 miles from downtown Detroit, its brick facade weathered and its sign modest enough to miss its speed. Every tool had a place. Every surface was clean in the way that only decades of discipline could produce. Mason was 39 years old, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with the kind of hands that remembered things his mouth rarely said. Neighbors who brought him their European sedans and Italian sports cars often left with the quiet, unsettled feeling that the man working on their vehicles knew more about them than the people who had built them. Mason never encouraged that impression. He simply did the work. On the corner of his workbench, half turned away from the entrance, sat a photograph in a simple frame. The image showed a younger Mason in a pressed workshop uniform, standing beside an unpainted Bugatti Chiron prototype in a large, pristine factory. Behind him, through tall glass windows, the green hills of the French countryside rolled gently toward the horizon. The city visible in the background was Molsheim. Mason had not put the photograph in a drawer, but he had also never once pointed it out to anyone. The Autotech Summit that year had drawn 3,000 delegates, 40 corporations, and more cameras than a film premiere. Cara Simmons, a senior technical reporter for AutoWorld magazine, had arrived 2 days early to research her centerpiece story, a long-form examination of how software had gradually come to dominate the luxury automotive space, absorbing decisions that once belonged to mechanical engineers. She had a notebook full of careful, hedged language and polished talking points from the executives she had already interviewed. She was hoping for something unexpected. When she arrived at the Meridian Grand on the morning of the summit, she noticed that the question most people in the lobby were asking was not what Alexandra Harmon would say from the stage. It was what she would arrive in. At 10:17 in the morning, Alexandra Harmon sat in the driver's seat of the Chiron in the hotel's underground VIP garage and turned the key. The engine fired exactly as it always did, a deep, layered sound like something industrial and alive, the signature of a 16-cylinder W engine built by fewer than 500 people in the world. It ran for exactly 1 second, then it stopped. The dashboard lit up with a cascade of warning codes, unfamiliar sequences, none of which corresponded to anything Alexandra had seen in 3 years of ownership, and then, as though nothing had happened, the display returned to standby mode. The car sat in perfect silence, as composed and indifferent as a locked vault. She tried again, same result. 1 second of engine life, then nothing. She tried a third time and a fourth, and each attempt produced an identical response, the brief roar of the W16, followed by absolute refusal. Alexandra Harmon was a woman who had built a company worth $14 billion from a rented office in her early 30s. She did not panic easily. But as she sat in the silent Chiron with the dashboard reading normal and the engine dead, she felt the particular cold of a problem she did not yet understand. She called Connor at 10:22. Connor Walsh received the call in his hotel room on the 4th floor, already dressed and reviewing the day's logistics. He listened to Alexandra's description without interrupting, and as she spoke he was already running the arithmetic. Keynote at 2, arrival and setup required by 1:30, roughly 3 hours to solve a problem on a car that no authorized dealership within driving distance could touch. He told her calmly, "I'll handle it." He had no idea yet how. He picked up his phone and began working through every number that might connect to a solution. The first call Connor made was to Autotech Diagnostic Corp., TitanCore's preferred high-performance technical support provider. The company operated on a priority contract with several major corporate accounts, and he reached their dispatch line in under 2 minutes. He was told a team would arrive within 25 minutes, acknowledged this, and returned to the garage, where Alexandra was standing beside the car with her arms folded and her eyes on the entrance. Neither of them said what they were thinking. There was still time. There was still a plan. What neither of them noticed, and what no one in the garage would notice until much later, was a faint, low-frequency electronic sound that pulsed briefly from the front of the engine bay each time the start sequence was attempted. It was not mechanical. It was the sound of a system trying to tell someone something in a language no one in the room had learned to hear. Jason Trent arrived at 10:45 with a team of 3 technicians from Autotech Diagnostics Corp., rolling a hard-shell equipment case on wheels that cost more than most people's cars. He was 52, gray-templed and confident, and he walked into the garage the way men walk into rooms they expect to leave having solved something. His team set up their proprietary OBD interface system in under 4 minutes and began reading. 23 fault codes came back across the Chiron's primary diagnostic channel. Every single one pointed to the central ECU, the electronic control unit that served as the car's operational brain. Jason reviewed the list with the practiced attention of someone who had seen dozens of European performance cars return from overseas service centers with identical readouts, and his conclusion was reached quickly and without doubt. He approached Alexandra and Connor and delivered it with the expression of a professional presenting a final, responsible verdict. The ECU module needed to be replaced, the correct part would have to be sourced directly from Molsheim, and the minimum lead time was 48 hours if the order was placed within the hour. The Chiron, he explained, was essentially in a protective lockdown, a feature of the car's architecture, not a failure. Alexandra looked at him for a long, deliberate moment. She said, "I didn't ask you what I need. I asked you if you can fix it." Jason held her gaze steadily, and then he said that he could not. His team packed their equipment and left the garage at 11:15. The second team arrived 9 minutes later. Adrian Cole, no relation to Mason, a coincidence that would only become notable in retrospect, led a 4-person unit from Novadrive Engineering, a company specializing in electronic systems for ultra-luxury vehicles. He had worked on Ferrari and Lamborghini platforms for nearly 2 decades and held a particular reputation for finding faults that digital readouts missed. He approached the Chiron with the methodical confidence of someone who had learned, through years of expensive mistakes, that assumptions were the enemy of accurate diagnosis. Rather than repeating what the first team had done, his crew attacked the problem from a different angle entirely, isolating individual electrical circuits and tracing them backward through the vehicle's system architecture, looking for upstream sources rather than downstream symptoms. After 35 minutes, Adrian found something, a minor anomaly in the vehicle's secondary charging pathway, a fluctuation small enough to read as noise, consistent enough across multiple attempts to be a genuine signal. He marked it, followed it through 2 subsystems, and then stopped. The anomaly was real, but it was downstream of something else. Something deeper in the firmware layer was instructing the hardware to behave this way, and Adrian did not have the access rights or the proprietary toolset to continue in that direction. The wall he had hit was not a mechanical wall. It was architectural. He told Connor honestly, "There's a firmware issue. You need a Bugatti engineer." He left at 12:05. Sebastian Marsch came from Stuttgart. He had flown in that morning for the summit itself and was reached by Connor through a mutual contact at a German automotive consulting group. Sebastian was 48, meticulous, and constitutionally disinclined toward conversation that was not technically productive. He greeted Alexandra with a single nod and did not speak again until he had spent 3 minutes walking silently around the exterior of the car. His diagnostic equipment was designed specifically for high-output W configuration of someone who had used it hundreds of times. He went directly to the fuel system. After 22 minutes of measurement, he announced a finding. The fuel pressure in the primary delivery circuit was reading 3% below specification, a small variance, but on a vehicle with tolerances as tight as the Chiron, potentially significant. In his assessment, this discrepancy was causing the engine management system to deny the start sequence as a precautionary measure. He adjusted the auxiliary fuel pump output, recalibrated the target pressure setting, and stepped back to ask for a restart. The car fired for 1 second. Then it stopped exactly as it had done every time before. Sebastian stood in front of his diagnostic screen for 10 full minutes without moving or speaking, and the people around him gave him the space to do so, because silence from a man like Sebastian Marsh usually meant something was being carefully processed. When his conclusion came, it was delivered quietly. "The data needs to go back to our team in Germany for analysis," he said. Connor Walsh said nothing. He did not trust himself to say anything. The team left at 12:50. Hunter Blake was the youngest technical lead among the 5, at 41, and he arrived at 12:55 carrying a custom laptop that looked like something a defense contractor would commission. He ran a software diagnostics company called Precision Tech Labs, and his particular specialty was ECU-level firmware analysis, the kind of deep system work that sat at the boundary between automotive engineering and computer science. He did not attempt the standard OBD interface that the first team had used. Instead, he ran a proprietary protocol through the vehicle's secondary communication port, establishing a connection at a layer of the car's control architecture that the previous 3 teams had not been able to reach. It took him 20 minutes just to authenticate the connection. What he found after 40 more minutes of analysis was genuinely significant. A conflict embedded in the firmware itself, a logical collision between the traction management module and the passive safety system, 2 subsystems that were supposed to operate in synchronized parallel, but were instead locked in a continuous cycle of mutual override. Each time the ignition was attempted, the 2 modules effectively canceled each other. Hunter identified the conflict precisely. He constructed a targeted firmware patch to interrupt the override cycle and applied it carefully. Then he asked Connor to attempt a start. The engine ignited. For 2 full seconds, the W16 came alive, and the sound of it filled the garage, and Connor Walsh took one involuntary step toward the car, and Cara Simmons, who had been watching from the doorway, straightened without realizing she had done it. Then the engine cut again, and the silence returned as though it had never left. Hunter sat very still and looked at his screen. "This conflict isn't a bug," he said slowly. "It's being triggered by an external physical condition that I can't identify from in here. The firmware is responding correctly to something. I just don't know what that something is." He was the closest any of them had come. He left at 1:35. Elijah Ford had not been on Connor's original list. He was 55 years old, a former Bentley development engineer who had spent the last several years as an independent consultant to collector car restorers and private estates across the eastern United States. A contact of a contact had reached him at 11 that morning with a description of the problem, and something in that description had pulled at something in his memory. He drove his own truck to the Meridian Grand rather than sending a team. He arrived at 1:40, alone, carrying a single canvas bag of tools and a spiral-bound notepad with pages folded back from years of use. He was the quietest of the 5. He did not connect anything to the car. No cables, no diagnostic interface, not even a handheld code reader. He walked around the Chiron once, at a measured pace, the way a person walks around something they are trying to understand through proximity and attention rather than instrumentation. Then he began a manual inspection, systematic and unhurried, both hands moving across the exterior surfaces, his ear brought close to panels and seams, his fingers pressing lightly into areas around the front fascia and the wheel arches. When he reached the front left section of the engine bay, he paused. His fingers found the area around the secondary cooling system housing, and something in his expression shifted. Not recognition exactly, but the proximity to it. "There's something wrong here," he said, to no one in particular, but he did not go further. The internal schematics he carried in his memory were for the Veyron generation, an entirely different engineering era more than 15 years removed from the Supersport 300+. The broad architecture he remembered, the generation-specific revisions he did not. He looked at Alexandra directly and said what it cost him to say, "I know what category of problem this is, I don't know how to reach it on this particular car." Alexandra turned away without speaking. It was not cruelty. She simply had no words left that were useful. Elijah Ford looked at the chyron for a long moment before he picked up his bag and walked out, and something in the way he looked at it suggested that he understood, on some level, that someone eventually would. It was 2:05 in the afternoon. The keynote had already begun without its intended speaker. Connor Walsh stood in the middle of the garage with his phone showing 4 missed calls from the summit's event coordinator. Alexandra Harmon stood on the other side of the Bugatti, one hand resting on the roof, looking at nothing in particular. She had not spoken in several minutes. For the first time in a long time, she was standing in front of a problem that money and authority could not move. Cara Simmons, who had heard something through the journalist's network, stood quietly near the garage entrance with a camera at her side. She had not asked permission to be there, and no one had asked her to leave. Connor Walsh was not a man given to superstition, but by 2:10 that afternoon he was calling every automotive service provider within a 5-mile radius of the hotel, working his way down a list he had assembled in 20 minutes of urgent searching. Most said they didn't work on that kind of vehicle. One said they could send someone tomorrow. One did not answer. Cole's Auto was the 8th number he dialed. A man picked up on the 3rd ring and said with no particular inflection, "Cole's." Connor explained the situation quickly. A Bugatti Chiron Supersport 300 Plus unable to start, 5 technical teams already on site with no resolution, critical time pressure. The man on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can come take a look. Not I can fix it, not I'll have it running in an hour, just I can come take a look." Connor said yes before he had finished thinking about it. Mason Cole arrived at 2:20 in the afternoon. He had not hurried and he did not look hurried. He carried a standard metal toolbox and had a small flashlight clipped to his breast pocket. He walked through the garage entrance and stopped for a moment, taking in the space, the lighting, the car, and the 2 people standing near it. Alexandra Harmon looked at him once, a single assessing look, the kind she gave to presentations in boardrooms and proposals on paper, and said nothing. Connor introduced Mason quickly, using his name and the name of his shop. Mason acknowledged this with a slight nod and then walked directly to the chyron. He did not ask about the fault codes. He did not ask what the previous teams had tried. He did not ask about the maintenance history or the last service interval. He set his toolbox down beside the car, crouched low, and placed his left hand flat against the lower body panel near the front axle. Then he reached up and placed his right hand higher, near the seam between the front fascia and the chassis rail. He stayed in that position for nearly 45 seconds without moving. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, almost to himself. "All right, let's hear it." Connor Walsh watched from 6 feet away and felt the discomfort of a logical man confronting something that did not fit a logical framework. He had expected a laptop or at minimum a scan tool. What he was watching looked less like technical troubleshooting and more like a man listening to a voice only he could hear. Alexandra had not moved. Her arms were at her sides now rather than folded across her chest, which was for her a form of concentrated attention. Cara Simmons raised her camera, held it at chest height, and then slowly lowered it without pressing the shutter. Something in the quality of the moment felt too fragile to interrupt. The garage was quiet enough that the distant hum of the hotel's ventilation system was audible. Mason Cole remained still, his hands on the car, and the car remained still under his hands, and for a few seconds, the only thing happening in that space was a man listening and a machine deciding whether or not to answer. Mason reached for his flashlight and directed its beam into the area below and behind the left front wheel arch, angling it upward toward a narrow space between the secondary cooling loop and the main chassis brace. His hand followed the light. He was not reading a schematic. He was navigating from memory, the memory of a man who had spent 8 years working inside the development cycle of this exact vehicle family, who had sat in engineering meetings where the cooling system configurations were revised between production generations, who had reviewed the component change documentation when Bugatti's engineering team modified the secondary temperature sensor bracket design, beginning with the 2nd year of Supersport 300 Plus production. The sensor was still there, in its correct general location, but it was not in its correct specific position. It had shifted, perhaps a few millimeters, perhaps from a minor road impact, perhaps from a vibration sequence no one would have logged. And in shifting, it was transmitting a temperature reading that was technically a reading, technically within a plausible range, but wrong. It was telling the car's safety architecture that the secondary cooling loop was approaching a thermal threshold that would, if real, indicate a risk of catastrophic engine damage. The safety system believed it. and the safety system, designed by engineers who took catastrophic engine damage seriously, had locked the entire start sequence. The car was not broken, it was protecting itself from a lie. Mason stood up, opened his toolbox, and removed a small angled wrench and a positioning tool. Not a specialized instrument, just a standard precision component that happened to be the correct size and geometry for the access point involved. He worked for 1 minute and 40 seconds. The sensor bracket was repositioned. He closed the toolbox, picked up the key fob from the center console where Alexandra had left it, and held it toward Connor. "Try it now," he said. Connor Walsh pressed the start button. The Bugatti Chiron Supersport 300 Plus ignited. The W16 woke up with the sound of something that had been waiting, deep and layered and unmistakably real, and it did not stop. The idle settled to its characteristic low frequency and stayed there, every system reading clean, every warning light dark. The car was running. Connor stared at the dashboard for 3 full seconds before he looked up. Alexandra Harmon had not moved. She was standing exactly where she had been standing, and her expression had changed in a way that was subtle and complete. Not shock, not relief, but the particular stillness of someone recalibrating what they believed they knew. Cara Simmons raised her camera and began pressing the shutter in the measured, unhurried sequence of someone who understands that the most important photograph is rarely the most dramatic moment. Mason Cole was putting his tools back into the box. Connor checked his watch. 2:27. 7 minutes since Mason had walked through the garage door. 5 minutes since he had started working. He looked at Mason, who was latching the toolbox closed with the same unhurried efficiency that had characterized every movement since his arrival. Alexandra crossed the garage and stood a few feet from him. The engine ran between them, low and steady, as though it had never been anything other than fine. She said, with none of the edge that had been in her voice all morning, "Where did you learn this car?" Mason picked up the toolbox and set it beside the door. He did not answer immediately. This was not evasion. It was simply the habit of a man who did not consider his past something that required rapid deployment. Connor Walsh had stepped back toward the entrance, giving the space to the two of them without being asked, which was the kind of social intelligence that had kept him employed by Alexandra Harmon for 6 years. After a moment, Mason said, "I used to work with this kind of car." He said it the way a person mentions that they once lived in a different city, factually without weight, leaving the listener to decide how much weight was appropriate. Cara Simmons heard the sentence from across the garage. She was a technical reporter, which meant she was trained to notice the gap between what a statement said and what it implied. She closed the distance in a few quiet steps and asked, before Alexandra could pursue her own line of questioning, "Where did you work?" Mason looked at her. He looked at her camera, at her notepad, at her press credential hanging from the lanyard at her neck. He seemed to perform a brief, private calculation, not strategic, simply honest, the kind of calculation a private person makes when the moment for privacy has passed. "Molsheim," he said. Cara Simmons had been covering the automotive industry for 11 years. She knew immediately what Molsheim meant. It was the name of a small town in northeastern France, and in the context of automobiles it meant one thing: the single facility in the world where every Bugatti ever produced had been built. The engineers who understood the Chiron at the molecular level went to work there. She did not ask a follow-up question immediately. She wrote the word in her notebook and drew a circle around it. Alexandra asked Connor and Cara to give her a few minutes. Both moved outside without argument. Connor because he recognized the particular register in her voice that indicated the conversation ahead was not one for an audience. Cara because she understood that the story would come back to her eventually regardless of whether she was in the room for it. The garage door rolled partway down behind them, and the sound of the Chiron's idle, still running, quiet and resolved, was the only sound filling the space between the two people left inside. Alexandra stood across the toolbox from Mason and said simply, "Tell me who you actually are." He met her eyes and held them without difficulty, and then he told her plainly and without any performance at all. His name was Mason Cole. He had joined Bugatti Automobiles as a junior systems engineer at age 26, having come out of a mechanical engineering program with a thesis focused on thermal management in high-displacement engines, which was, as it happened, precisely the kind of background that Bugatti's recruitment team was looking for at the time. In the 8 years that followed, he had risen steadily until he led the development team for the W16 powertrain architecture. He had been part of the Chiron's original engineering committee. He had been in the room, specifically a glass-walled conference room in the Molsheim facility overlooking the production floor, When the secondary cooling sensor configuration was debated, revised, and then revised again after a test driver reported a thermal variance anomaly during a cold-weather endurance run in northern Sweden. The Supersport 300 Plus generation had a sensor bracket modification introduced in its second production year, a change made to address a micro-vibration pattern identified during extended high-speed runs. The modification was real. It was in the engineering documentation, but it had not been communicated broadly outside the Molsheim technical team, which meant that no third-party diagnostic company, regardless of how sophisticated their equipment, would have had any reason to look for it. No external diagnostic system would have found it, because no external diagnostic system carried the institutional memory necessary to know what to look for. The system that Hunter Blake had nearly reached, the firmware conflict, the override cycle, was the car's correct response to a physical input that no one else in that garage could have named. Alexandra listened to all of this without speaking. She was, among her many qualities, a good listener when the information was worth her attention, and this information was worth her full attention. When Mason finished, she asked the question she had actually wanted to ask from the beginning. Why was he here, in a small garage on a side street in Detroit, and not somewhere that reflected what he had just described? Mason was quiet for a moment. The Chiron ran steadily between them, its idle even and unbothered. Then he said, "My wife died 7 years ago. I needed to stop moving and stay in one place. A garage was something I could do completely, no travel, no facilities in 3 countries, no calls at midnight from Europe. I wanted to work on cars in the same building every day and go home at night." He said it without apology and without self-pity, which made it, in its plainness, one of the most honest things Alexandra Harmon had heard anyone say to her in a long time. She had built her career inside a world that rewarded the appearance of composure, and she had gotten very good at recognizing when composure was genuine and when it was constructed. Mason Cole's composure was genuine. She stood with the information for a moment, looking at the Chiron. The engine ran on between them, patient and steady, as though it had been waiting its whole life for someone to find the right thing to say to it. The summit's event coordinator was, to his significant credit, a pragmatic man. When Connor Walsh called at 2:35 and explained that Alexandra Harmon would be arriving shortly and required the keynote slot shifted to 4 o'clock, the coordinator moved 3 sessions, renegotiated 2 room bookings, and sent a revised schedule to 3,000 tickets devices within 40 minutes. He did not ask what had caused the delay. In his line of work, the answer to that question was rarely worth the time it took to get. Alexandra drove the Chiron out of the Meridian Grand Garage at 3:15, alone, the same way she had always intended to arrive, no convoy, no escort, just the car and the road and the engine that had refused to run for 2 hours and was now running as though it had never considered doing anything else. Cara Simmons, who had been standing outside, watched the car clear the ramp and turn onto the boulevard, its engine audible half a block away and then a full block away and then gone. She was already composing the opening line of her article in her head. It would not be about technology. It would be about knowledge, and where it lives, and what happens when the two things come apart. Alexandra Harmon walked onto the Autotech Summit stage at 4:03 in front of 2,900 delegates. 300 had left when the schedule shifted, but the rest had stayed, which was itself a statement about the weight of her name. The Chiron was parked outside the main entrance, visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the convention hall. She stood at the podium for 2 full seconds before she spoke, which was 2 seconds longer than her prepared remarks required, and everyone in the room understood that something had changed. She did not begin with the Series D announcement. She did not begin with the market projection slides her communications team had prepared. She began with the story of that morning, not as an embarrassment, not as a clever anecdote, but as a precise and unflinching account. She described the 5 teams, their equipment, their collective intelligence, the diagnostic systems brought to bear on the problem one after another. She described the silence that had settled over the garage after the 5th team left. And then she described a man with a toolbox and a flashlight who had arrived with no promises and no preamble and done in 5 minutes what 2 hours of institutional expertise could not. She did not use Mason's name. She did not need to. What she said instead was this: real knowledge doesn't need a logo, it doesn't need a conference room or a slide deck or a press release. It needs years, enough years to become part of the person who carries it. That is the kind of knowledge that actually builds things. And it is the kind of knowledge that this industry, and every industry that depends on what we build, desperately needs to find ways to recognize before it quietly goes home and locks the door. The room was quiet for the kind of moment that happens in large audiences when something unexpectedly true has been said aloud. Then the applause began, not the polite, measured kind that follows a well-executed presentation, but the louder, longer kind that means something has landed. Cara Simmons, seated in the second row with her notebook open, did not look up. Hunter Blake, sitting near the back of the hall after leaving the garage at 1:35, was very still. He had understood immediately, as the story unfolded from the stage, who the man with the toolbox was. He understood what the secondary cooling sensor meant, and why he had been unable to identify the physical trigger behind the firmware conflict his own software had detected. He was not humiliated by this. He was taking notes. There was something specific he intended to research when he returned to his lab, and Mason Cole, a man whose name he had not been given, had pointed him toward it without ever having spoken to him. After the applause settled and Alexandra moved into the substance of her address, Cara Simmons slipped quietly out of the hall and drove back to Cole's auto. The garage was still open. The lights were on. She found Mason reassembling a fuel injector on a late-model German sedan and waited until he set it down before she spoke. She told him she had been in the garage that morning and had seen what happened. She told him she was writing about it. He did not object. She had one question she wanted to ask before she finished the piece, and she wanted to ask it in person. She asked him if he regretted leaving behind what he had built at Bugatti. The years, the access, the recognition, the proximity to work that only a handful of engineers in the world ever got close to. Mason looked at her for a moment and then said he would answer, but he needed to think about how to say it correctly. Cara Simmons waited. She was a patient person when the answer was likely to matter. Mason Cole looked at the floor of the garage and then looked up. "I didn't leave it behind," he said. "I took it with me. The difference is that I'm no longer measured by what I left there." He said it without emphasis, without the rhetorical weight a person adds to a line they have rehearsed. It sounded like something he had arrived at slowly over several years and had not particularly expected to say out loud. Cara wrote it down exactly as he had said it. She had written thousands of quotes in 11 years of reporting, and she recognized immediately that this one would close her piece. Alexandra Harmon called Mason Cole at 8:45 that evening. He stepped outside the restaurant to take the call. She told him that Titan Core Technologies was entering a new phase of its autonomous vehicle hardware division, and that the division was encountering a recurring class of technical problem, a gap between the software diagnostics its teams relied on and the physical system behaviors those diagnostics were failing to capture. She was not calling to offer him a position. She was calling to ask if he would be willing to serve as an independent technical consultant, retained on his own terms, working at his own pace, with no obligation to travel, no internal title, no reporting hierarchy. He could keep the garage, he could keep his schedule, he could decline any assignment he chose not to take. She made the offer in approximately 90 seconds, which was considerably less time than most people took to explain what they were asking for. Mason stood on the sidewalk with the street noise around him and listened to the offer in its entirety, and then he was quiet for long enough that Alexandra heard the traffic on his end of the line and understood that he was actually genuinely considering it. She did not fill the silence. This was a change from how she had behaved most of the day, and she knew it. "I need to think about it," Mason said. Alexandra told him to take whatever time he needed and ended the call. She set her phone face down on the desk of her hotel room and sat in the quiet. She thought about the garage that morning, about the 5 teams and their equipment and their certainty, and about the man who had arrived after all of them and stood beside a car with his hands open and his mouth closed. She thought about what she had said from the stage, and she thought about whether she actually believed it or had simply recognized its usefulness in the moment. By the time she finished thinking, she had concluded that she believed it and that the two things were not mutually exclusive. She turned out the light. Mason Cole returned to the garage late that evening, after the restaurant had closed and the street outside had gone quiet. He did this sometimes, not to work, but simply to be in the space when it belonged entirely to him, when the air in it was just air and not a transaction or a performance. He sat on the stool at his workbench and looked at the photograph from Molsheim. The younger version of himself stood beside the unpainted Chiron prototype with the French hills behind him, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man at the beginning of something large. Not certain of where it would lead, but certain that it was worth following. Mason had forgotten that the younger version of himself had looked like that. He looked at the photograph for a long time, letting himself look at it without immediately looking away, which was what he usually did. He did not turn it face down, which was the other thing he usually did when the past pressed too closely on the present. He left it where it was, angled slightly toward the room the way it had always been before he had started turning it away. Nothing had been decided. He had not said yes to Alexandra Harmon's offer, and he did not know yet if he would. There were real reasons to say no: the simplicity of the garage, the particular completeness of a day that started and ended in the same building, the peace of not being measured by what he knew. But there were also, he was beginning to admit to himself, real reasons to consider otherwise. He had fixed a car that morning that 5 well-resourced teams could not fix, and the experience of doing it had not felt like a return to something he had left. It had felt like a confirmation of something he had always carried. He turned off the workbench lamp, locked the garage, and drove home through the quiet streets of Detroit. And the city moved past the windows in the dark the way it always did, familiar and unchanged, asking nothing of him that he had not already decided to give.